Anielski. I'm the happiness economist. I spend my time measuring happiness and the well-being of communities, and I'm trained in forestry and economics at the University of Alberta. And I spent some time with the Pembina Institute and had fond memories of those times.
So when did you first become interested in environmental or sustainability issues?
Probably in the early days, when even in my 20s, when I loved backpacking. I did do a forestry degree from 1984, in 1984, and so I've always been interested in environmental issues, in particular natural capital, which is what I really got into in the early 90s.
So Mark, if you had to say what the most pressing issue is facing us in Canada today, what would that be?
The most pressing issue, in my opinion, as a also former accountant, is that we have no balance sheet to run the country. That means we have no accounting of our natural assets, wetlands, forests, carbon, or our human or social capital. You can't run a business without a balance sheet, and yet we run our nation and our municipalities and provinces without a balance sheet. I think that's the most pressing issue, in my opinion.
So Mark, how did you first come across Pembina?
Actually, I met Rob McIntosh and with Elizabeth May. We were on a panel together in 1999 at a Parkland Institute conference, and that's where Rob convinced me to join Pembina, the so-called dream team of environmental consultancy.
Consultants, or was it the economics that made it unique?
I would say with the economics, I would say that Rob believed in my vision of doing the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is what I brought to Pembina. I pitched them on that. I was going to do that at the University of Alberta, but Pembina seemed like a better fit for me, and I was excited by the youth, by the energy within Pembina, and I knew that we could do a really great job of the Genuine Progress Indicator with funding that we got from the federal government ultimately.
And so what did you find with the Genuine Progress Indicator?
We found that Alberta's GDP, their gross domestic product, had been rising. I looked back to when I was born, 1960, and said, well, the GDP was growing at 4% a year, but the overall index of well-being, we call the GPI, actually had stagnated, in fact declined since the 90s. And so the headlines in the Globe and Mail were Fat Cat, Albertans struggle with happiness, and on the Edmonton Journal, Alberta's natural capital slipping. Those were the big headlines in the media. And my favorite comment of all was Ralph Klein, who basically said nothing when we released our report. So I knew that we were onto something.
So, and of course, this work on Genuine Progress Indicators led you into what you said earlier, the happiness business, and led you down all kinds of interesting paths. What's an example of somewhere really interesting that this has taken you?
Well, it's taken me into the whole realm of what defines happiness. The word wealth means the conditions of well-being in the Old English. So now we think of capital and wealth differently, more completely, more holistically. And there actually is a science of happiness. So it's leading me increasingly into understanding what actually do people value in terms of what defines their quality of life, and how can we measure what matters to people most. That's where I'm going increasingly. Less and less into natural capital issues, more into quality of life and really the whole determinants of happiness.
How can that make a difference in the world? What difference will that make?
Well, I believe that our GDP has been growing, but the self-rated happiness has been basically stagnant. So why do we need to keep growing when there aren't any more very happy people in the world? I think there's an opportunity to celebrate a more resilient economy that doesn't have to grow, that is focused on self-sufficiency and this notion of resilience, which actually comes from ecology. So I think that's a much more compelling economic argument to make than simply continuous growth. For what purpose? Except it looks more like a cancer cell than it does a forest, which is always moving towards homeostasis or resiliency.
So as an economist today with a biological background and education, you also come by your social interests honestly. How so?
Social interests, I'm passionate about building economies of communion, of knowing that because most of what determines happiness is our relationships. So I'm always interested in how do we work together? How do we learn how to cooperate together? That's what word competition means, is to strive together. So how as community do we learn to share? Do we get past this kind of need for accumulation of material things, when in fact what we really long for is relationships and playing together, sharing, whether it's the community step ladder, or maybe one vehicle for the neighborhood, etc. Those are things that really jazz me now, is building those resilient, sustainable communities here in Edmonton, where I live.
So Pembina's played some pretty interesting and diverse roles in its 25 years. What has it meant to you? Like, what does Pembina mean to you?
Pembina to me is a really exciting place where young energy and people can find a voice to follow their own passions, their own sense of maybe environmental injustice, to address some of the most pressing issues. That we actually get hired to do this work. We get hired to have the confidence of government and sometimes industry. And yet we reserve the right to advocate on what we think sustainability should look like. And that's what I really liked about Pembina, is that it provided that place where people could, young people in particular, could get learn something about consultancy, how to pitch an idea, how to do really applied research. And it's an exciting place to work and to play.
What's one place that Pembina has made a difference that you think is notable?
Well, I personally think on the GPI work we did in 2001, and that was updated in 2005, I think that really raised the high bar for economic research. I think they've also done a pretty good job on the climate file, and talking about valuing tradable permits and all these other things that are on the carbon issue. But of course I'm biased towards the GPI, and I think that was one of our great success stories.
So is there something about Pembina's approach that you think is different or notable or special?
Well, I like the delicate balance they try to play between working with, say, industry, Suncors of the world, and yet continuing to be on point about what a sustainable economy or future should look like. So being bold enough to continue to advocate, being free to criticize governments and industry for staying true to a commitment to sustainability. So I really like that about Pembina and the model both as a consultancy model and advocacy.
Mark, what do you see as the most important sustainability issue of the future to address?
I think it's about money. I think unless we understand where money comes from and how it's created, all the nice conversations about sustainability won't happen. They won't be achieved. And money right now, the way it's created as a debt, we truly are mortgage, which means a pledge unto death. And so unless we figure this one out, all the nice conversations about climate change don't matter a bit, in my opinion. And I see a collective ignorance about this issue that there needs to be awareness, growing awareness, so that we can advocate for a new system which ties money to natural capital, things like that.
Well, if you forgive me, Mark, I think if I asked that question of a senior oil executive, he might tell me the same answer, but I think he might have slightly different meaning.
Yes, he may. Because again, most, including the oil executives, don't have a clue where money comes from or how it's created. And unless we grow up as society, a global society, and shift the way the money system works, which is in the interests of the well-being of society, to actually facilitate happiness and resilience, we basically have a runaway debt economy that has no way to go except collapse.
Mark Anielski, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.